opening session. I think this is fantastic. Buildings that go beyond an exploration into the minds and motivation of two visionary architects. There's that old Churchill quote that I'll sort of paraphrase, is that, you know, we build buildings and then they build us. In this session, we explore the minds and these motivations of these two architects to try and understand how and why buildings evolve into the physical and social places they ultimately become. Our first speaker or first guest is Karl Fender, the founding partner of Fender Katsalidis Architects. Karl is an undisputed industry leader, a champion of Australia's ongoing urbanisation, and a formidable example of architecture's contribution to the public realm. Currently, Karl serves as the chairman of the jury for the Council of Tall Buildings and Urban Habitats, has served as both national and state president of the Australian Institute of Architects, a Venice Biennale committee member, and has sat on various design review panels for state governments. Karl is also one of the three-person design review panel acting for the Barangaroo Delivery Authority, which has governed the master planning, urban design and delivery of the Western Harbourfront precinct of Sydney. Please welcome Karl to the stage, ladies and gentlemen. Our next guest is an overseas visitor. Bill Sharples is the founding principal of Shop Architects, regarded as one of the world's preeminent architects. Bill is responsible for leading a New York-based global studio with projects spanning 5 continents. With a reputation for delivering intelligent and evocative projects in complex urban contexts, Shop are responsible for some of the most high-profile projects in the United States, including Uber's HQ, Google's Silicon Valley campus, Barclays Centre, and 111 West 57th Street in New York City. In Australia, Shop has partnered with Woods Bagot to design the striking Collins Arch in Melbourne CBD. Dubbed the Pants Scraper, Collins Arch is regarded as one of the most transformational projects in the APAC region. Please welcome Bill to the stage, ladies and gentlemen. Good to see you. Just pop you down there. Gentlemen, how are we?
Very well, thank you.
Good to have you here. We might just, how are you feeling, Bill? You're okay? Jet lagged?
I'm getting used to it.
How many times have you been out here? A few now?
Yes, it's been traveling back and forth 5 years.
So
it's
you're all over the place.
first time to Brisbane now.
Well, welcome. It's good to have you both here. Let's start with talking about your respective cities and where they're at the moment. I might start with you, Bill, because you are our overseas visitor. Where's New York at the moment?
New York's going through, I would say, renaissance. When did it all start? I would say it started on September 11th, 2001. In terms of urbanity and the transformation of cities, it's hard to fathom evolution when you're working with like an existing canvas that's all built up. But when you had an event like 9/11, where everything south of Canal Street, mile down to the tip of Lower Manhattan, was kind of in a complete disarray, had to be rethought. All those ingredients, as you had mentioned, in terms of civic space, choice, 24/7, all those experiences were all rediscovered down in Lower Manhattan. Before 9/11, it was a 9-to-5 community, and now it is, 10,000 apartments, 4 schools, new hospital, public parks, and it's one of the most vibrant parts of the whole city. So for me, and that's where our office is located, that's where I live, that's where my kids go to school, it's actually been a great experience over the last 19 years to see that and utilize that DNA to help us as designers think about that in other locations in the world.
Why are people so drawn to New York from all over the world? What is it?
Well, I grew up on a farm in Chester County, Pennsylvania with horses. And I went to New York, first time I went to New York was in 1976 for a UN, visit the UN, and my brother, my identical twin brother, and I fell in love with it. We moved to New York in 1990 and never left. The thing about New York is you either hate it or you love it. And I think the people who love it want that energy, want that challenge, want to be pushed. And sometimes you don't make it. But it's where a lot of great ideas, or great architecture, great arts, great business, you just want to be in the middle of it, and you kind of play off that cross-pollination. So I think that's really what attracts people to any major city around the world, is that cross-pollination of all these different experiences and programs. And again, it plays very well into something like what Urbanity's talking about.
Karl, Melbourne's got that in spades too, hasn't it? Where's your city at?
I should start that by saying that my parents arrived in Melbourne in 1952. They were migrants after the Great War, Dutch people from living in Indonesia, and they got a little house in Burwood. Now, there were no roads, there was no sewerage, there was a fence at the end of my street, there was a forest, there was a cut tree. It was quite a remarkable time in Melbourne. A lot of migrants coming in and looking for the Australian dream of home ownership. Little did we know that we were the pioneers of suburban sprawl. We thought we were at the end of the world, but actually the end of the world now is about another 100 kilometres out. So from there, Melbourne really became an opportunity of home ownership, and the city of Melbourne was a city that was a commercial city. Didn't have anyone living there. So at 5:30, people would basically finish their work, they'd rush to the pub, the pub's closed at 6, half an hour of 6 beers and drive back out to the suburbs. And this doesn't make for a vibrant, living, best city, best livable city in the world. It was only in the 90s when residential was introduced, high density living in the city. And at the beginning there were quite a lot of naysayers. Apartment? I mean, why would you live in a little apartment? Well, if we had another few days, we could talk about all the good reasons for living in an apartment, in the city, where you work, the security, the views, all of the things that people now absolutely love in Melbourne. And so the last 20 years has been transformational in Melbourne. Our population in Melbourne has grown. I think there are 120,000 people last year came into Melbourne. And what you see is one of the most vibrant, beautiful places to live in the world. It's unlike New York. New York's got its own stunning characteristics, but as a balanced city, a place to live, work, enjoy recreational programs, parks, gardens, it's fantastic.
We might just scoot back to, because I think postcode 3000, which was what's transformed Melbourne into the Melbourne that we know today, and when you talked about, on the weekends it was tumbleweeds and everything closed and no one was living there. The laneways we know of today weren't there. Talk us through what happened with postcode 3000, obviously, and you had a huge part with, really the first residential building there in the city.
It was a vision about how to make it a livable city, how to have density in the city, and hopefully how to control that density. And we're still going through refinement, as it were, because with density, you get a lot of public opinion that's against it. When I say a lot, probably just a few people, but they make a lot of noise, and which is one of the banes of my existence. I just can't bear reading about how in high density living, you don't know your neighbours, you don't know anyone, you're locked up there, there's no ventilation, it's like a jail cell. It couldn't be further from the truth. So Melbourne's come a long way. When our first residential building in Melbourne was near the market. Melbourne Terrace was just a beaut little 7-storey building, 7 stories because at that height you had limited fire regulations to deal with. And then our next building was Republic Tower, which was the same number of apartments, about 100, but instead of being that, it was that. That was the first high-rise in Melbourne, and it's still thought of as one of the groundbreaking projects in Melbourne that introduced it and also made it perhaps more acceptable in a lot of people's minds. But it's an evolving art and science to properly house people, and obviously as the sites run out, it becomes harder and harder.
I think there's some parallels between both of you not being city dwellers. But Bill, let's go back to when you were a kid. what was around that was inspiring you from an architectural point of view? What was clicking something on?
Well, I grew up in a place called Chadds Ford. I don't know if you know the artists, but the Wyeth family, NC, Andrew and Jamie Wyeth. And, NC was an illustrator. And they were, as painters, they abstracted the landscape and the architecture in that landscape. There was one painting of this old white farmhouse where NC erased all the windows except one. And suddenly your interpretation of the building and the landscape took on in somewhat of haunting impact. But it was the first time you're seeing how building and landscape and atmosphere could start, informing you in terms of how you interpret a space. I grew up in a 1730s farmhouse. Ironically, my brother's house he has in Connecticut is Marcel Breuer's.
Oh, wow.
And my wife and I, partner, have an old farmhouse in Orient. Now, I can do anything I want to my farmhouse, but Chris, it's like he's a curator now, and it's stressful. But at the same time, the experiences of those two places for our kids is remarkable. They see design in very different ways. Their sense of utility, but utility ranged around a different performance envelope. And I think that's, for us, had the biggest influence as architects evolving, is that we don't look at it as form making, we don't look at style, we look at like experience and place making. And so I think what I got out of my growing up in Chadds Ford and then my visits to Philadelphia, which was only 25 miles away, was to start to understand how place-making architecture could inform you in terms of what worked and what didn't work. I think the most great space is timeless, in the ancients to the present, but understanding those kind of rules and those relationships is really what's key. And I think teaching, as a studio critic, one of the biggest challenges teaching students in architecture is that they have to get out and experience life. It's not a linear. I came to architecture in my late 20s, early 30s. I was a structural engineer. And I think that's the other aspect, is that it's a life experience. You'll do it the rest. We never retire. We constantly live off of these experiences, and they inform us. But I think that's what makes the profession of design and creativity so exciting, is it's just always in the present, and it's also predicated on, obviously, your memory and the experiences of places you go.
What about for you, Karl? What was it?
What was
when
what?
you were young, what was inspiring you?
I was inspired by everything around me. It was
Yeah.
great to be alive.
Yeah.
And that's the great thing about architecture. It's great to be alive, and it's great to try and make other people's lives richer. And excuse me for chewing. I've got a throat job
That's
going
okay.
on here. I grew up, as I said, in the new suburbs, and that meant that I could roam around, crawl over houses that were under construction, steal a few bits of timber, make my own house in the back of not a granny flat, but it was a Karl flat for me and my mates. And doing that gives one the fundamentals of what makes great space, something that you've kind of conceived yourself, something that's a hideaway from the cruel world of school and the neighbourhood thugs. And in a way, that's what we're trying to do when we build or design our buildings, and especially when those buildings have a great impact on the broader built environment. So trying to create buildings that do make people respond, that make people feel inspired, enlightened, and which give them a memory of place. That, we develop through our memories, and if the memories are rich, then hopefully we're richer for it.
Well, let's talk about this idea of timelessness. I think this is important. How do you make a building that's timeless? What's the trick? I'm sure everyone would like to know.
I think it goes back to the experience.
Yeah.
In the case of 447, you're talking about a building that's 140,000 square meters, placed in kind of a hinge point in the city, a historic street such as Collins, and it's got a very diverse program, but it all starts at the ground plane. We always talk, we reference the first 40 feet or the first 12 meters. That's where the public, the pedestrian, comes in contact. And that's where, the idea of what are those experiences in terms of, the memories, but also in terms of the diversity. It's not one, it's many different things. That's what I love about the laneways in Melbourne. You go down to any laneway and it has its own memory placemaking. And this was something that was really critical to our client CBIS, was that we had an office, we have a hotel, we have residential, and retail, and how do you bring all those together and create an experience that engages its surroundings? So again, this idea of civic space, this civic gesture, this public space. And great architecture, you can't have great architecture without those elements, those pedestrian elements. And then it comes down to the materiality. How do you take a building, of that mass and bring it down to the ground plane where it scales itself to the pedestrian? So you think of, these precast portals that we have that are 12 meters high, but then we've incorporated these wood coffers and lighting and bluestone and an amphitheater and a park. These elements start to humanize the experience. And I think, and the other aspect is that the building doesn't have a back to itself. All four sides, Williams, Collins, Flinders, Market, all have different experiences. Sometimes it's the entry of the commercial lobby or the residential or the hotel, but the fact is it has this vitality. And I think in all of our projects we focus on, whether it's 111 West 57th Street, which is over an historic building, the Steinway building, where we created this 200, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to speak English, 200 feet atrium to celebrate the historic landmark of this piano company, to Barclays Arena, where instead of putting the marquee and blaring it out in the neighborhood, we create this huge oculus the size of a basketball court and put the marquee on the inside. And so as you come up from the subway, because there's no cars in this arena, you experience that moment of porosity into the building. So it all comes down to the ground plane and how the public, how the pedestrian engages. And it's not prescriptive. It cannot be, because if it's prescriptive, they'll figure it out immediately and know that you're trying to pull something on them. So that's something you just let happen. And for me and for my partners, it's the most energizing thing about, especially when they start naming it. I love the pan scraper. They named the Barclays the Angry Clam. That's when it becomes personal.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask this. Is it something you're proud of? What does it say about us when we nickname a building?
You're personalizing. I mean, I think people are relating to it. Yeah. They're not looking at it, it's a piece of architecture, and look, they use it. It kind of reminds them of something, and suddenly it becomes embedded in their psyche that, there's the pan scraper. Okay, I mean, now that could mean very different meanings for them, but when we heard that nickname come up in the Melbourne press, we said, yeah. Now that's how everyone remembers that project right now.
And it becomes part of the legend of the city.
Yes, absolutely.
The stories of the city.
I hope during the Formula One race they do mention it, the pan scraper.
I mean, it's fantastic.
Eureka Tower, the first national election that was held, it was the Tower of Power. And they were using it as a scale for the two parties.
Great.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you think people feel about large buildings? I mean, we know how everyone feels about domestic architecture. Their workplaces a lot of the time. How do people feel about them? What's our relationship with tall buildings?
Isn't it fantastic how people love them or hate them? It's as simple as that. Look, they love to hate, but actually they're part of the world. They are the world. And those tall buildings have a great responsibility to do a lot of the things, or all of the things that Bill was saying. If a building is extruded, and it's boring, and it's hasn't considered sustainability or amenity, it's not a great contribution to our society. And but then again, if a building is sculptured, as you go around it, it's not just a boring object. It adds to the city, richness of the city skyline. If it provides amenity for the people that live in it or work in it, beyond expectation, then they're hard to criticise. You know, I have owned one house. It was in Box Hill when I was first married, and my memories of that are building this huge fence because the street was used as a traffic shortcut, and fighting this guy that was trying to steal my car. And I'm not a fighter. And then I travelled. I lived in London, Rome, Boston, Hong Kong, Bangkok, always in apartments. And it sort of made it very clear to me that apartment living, which normally is high density if you're in the city, puts you where everything is. So it's an enormous advantage to your life. I actually live in Eureka Tower and my office is over the road, so I walk across the road and I'm always forgetful, so I walk back to the apartment and go up and get what I forgot and walk it back. And, you know, people, the traffic problems that we're, you know, experiencing now are really something to be...
How do you think Australians are adapting to apartment living?
Incredibly. That first few years when apartments were being looked at suspiciously was when we launched Eureka Tower. Now, Eureka Tower was the tallest building in Australia, and they were quite large apartments, but it had a whole range of apartments to cater for everybody. What gave me incredible pride in Melbourne and the confidence to go on was the fact that it was so popular. This was a huge experiment. They were selling 150 apartments here, 150 apartments there. This was 600 apartments, and it sold. People love it. And the community in that building now still love it and are very strong.
Bill, do you think there's room for local personality as our cities tend to start to look the same in terms of building styles as a global style of architecture? Is there still room for local personality?
Absolutely. You know, one of the challenges cities have, and just across the world, and in particular in New York, is that we have a housing crisis. Obviously, we have also the issue of climate change and resiliency, and getting back to, you know, its relevance to the local involvement in terms of how to execute the evolution of cities. The challenge we have, though, is the cost of real estate, the cost of construction is only going up. And cities are only going to survive, and again, density is the most sustainable thing you could have. You know, urban sprawl is not sustainable in the situation, the environmental situation we're going towards. And what Karl's represented is exactly that people actually love to live in the city because there's choice, there's vibrancy, but at the end of the day, right now, most people can't afford to live in the city. The people commuting to New York who live or work in the city, a lot of blue collar, can't afford to live there. And so for us, it's really, that's the crisis. How are we going to work? And it's not about disrupting the industry. The AEC industry has to evolve. Technology is a big part of this. I always go to the McKinsey Global Institute report from 2017, where they have this chart, relevance, digitization and growth, productivity. And they've got technology and communication and manufacturing up here. Then they've got forestry, fishing, and agriculture, and then construction's at the bottom. We have to figure out how to re-engage a much more sustainable way in terms of building that allows more people the opportunity to live in our cities. And I think that's something that and I would say Australia, all the cons right now are incredibly aggressive with this. CLT, prefab, well, the modular buildings right next to 447 is probably one of the best modular buildings I've seen outside North America. This is the kind of stuff, this is the kind of innovation we need to see, because at the end of the day, and this is local innovation, but if you don't have this, the only people who are going to be able to afford in the city are the people that have money, and that is a killer. But it's also a climate issue that you're also forcing that you don't need to force. So again, I think if everyone in this audience, this is one of the biggest challenges we need to address is in terms of how can we build smarter, how can we build more efficiently, and it's possible. It's possible. I think with the technology we have today, the brain power, local brain power here as well as in the States and Europe, it is very possible. But it's one of the biggest challenges our industry is facing right now.
Karl, what do you think the solution is for the urban sprawl in Melbourne, where there's room to keep going, unlike Sydney?
I think that the decentralisation of work opportunities and helping those areas rich, so you have more concentrated centres. And the government in Melbourne's trying to make now the rail link to help sustain growth centres. So I think that's very important. The problem with suburban sprawl is that there's a poverty of facilities for people. It's getting better, and I think that a lot of the land developers now have to actually show facility for the new estates that are being produced. But look, it's an evolution, isn't it? These things don't happen overnight. And again, 20 years ago in Melbourne, an apartment was not a popular thing. Now an apartment is a very, very popular commodity, and so I think it'll balance out.
We're going to take some questions from the audience, but just before we do, I will ask you, because you mentioned before, and it seems to be always the idea that architects will work forever. What inspires you guys to want to work forever? What's the drive?
It's not work. That's the first thing. I mean, I grew up, my father was a stockbroker, and he was good at it, but he hated his job. And we never talked about work at the table. Corey and I, my partner and wife, we work together. We come home, we have dinner with the kids every night, and we talk about what they're doing, we talk about what we're doing, and they are very opinionated about our work. I mean, they're able to actually have a pretty, one's 16 and the other one's 12. But I think that's where, it's not work at the end of the day, it's experience. It's like, yeah, it's incredibly stressful. Yeah, we have to hit our budgets. We do have those occasional meetings with clients where we get yelled at, we yell back. But I wouldn't trade anything for like being able to get on a plane, go anywhere in the world, whether it's South Africa or it's Melbourne, Australia, or Milan and Seoul. It's just like you're seeing the whole globe going through, wrestling with the same issues, slightly differently, and then you got politics. And we won't get into politics, but you're in the middle of it. Architecture is in the middle of it, and I'm turning 56 next week. I'm in
Happy birthday.
Second half of my life, and I couldn't ask for. We got some serious challenges to solve for our future kids and future generations, and I wouldn't trade that kind of challenge in for anything. So I'm really excited about it. And if you look at all the architects, Caesar Pelli just recently passed away, and so forth, that they all practice right up in. Gary's just as strong as ever, does a lot of teaching still and so forth. So it's a great profession to be in. You're in the middle of everything, and I would trade that for anything.
What is it for you, Karl? Or are you ready to retire?
No, I'm not. Look, it is a passion, there's no doubt about it. It's all encompassing. And the thing about architecture is that the further you travel, the more you learn, and you never quite get there. There's always more to learn, more to experience. So it's an absolutely wonderful, engaging, and global language. And you go to the Venice Biennale, and it's all the architects come together. It's like a bunch of brothers. We're all talking about the same problems and the same opportunities, and it's a very, very rich, profession. It's fabulous, actually.
Yeah, cool. Adam, did you want to? Have we got any questions in the audience? Just up here at the front.
Thanks for sharing today. Out of everything you've said, so I might have another 70 years on this planet. I'm nearly 30. What do you think is, kind of the number one thing that you'd want to pass on to someone like me in terms of how we think about cities and what we kind of do moving forward to support, I don't know, this like ever-growing concept of, you know, having vibrant space, creating areas that people love to go, and create that sense of experience so that we can nickname things in the future. Because right now, it kind of feels like it's a very individual kind of world, and we're kind of moving towards this concept of like, it's about me first and then others. So what would you leave someone like me with that would, I guess, allow me to have some freedom in how I could best serve like the cities that we're developing?
Look, it's a very personal journey. The issues that's at hand are obvious. We all know the problems of housing affordability, sustainability, high-rise, low. It's all out there. But I think everyone's on their own journey, and certainly that means looking, listening, observing, experiencing, thinking, reading. It's all of those sort of aspects that help you to have a better sensitivity towards the problems at hand. I don't think it's the magic wand at all. It's a long journey, and it takes commitment, and you sound like you're committed.
Yeah, I would say one thing. I mean, I studied engineering, worked as an engineer in the mid to late 80s and early 90s, and then went back to school for architecture. And the four founding partners all started in different fields. Greg was in finance, worked as an investment banker on Wall Street. My future wife partner, Corey, was in marketing. Chris was political science and art history, great in cocktail parties. And so I would say that what you should focus, because the thing, you know, this is a challenge when you teach studio, and I don't really do that anymore as we're so, but you know, in the old days, you teach studio, everyone would be assigned, you know, they would take on the project and they would work it themselves. That's not the way Chris, Greg, and I teach. We always teach as you pair up students or you work in a collective. This idea, and I appreciate visionary, but that, you know, this whole thing with the frickin' star architects and the visionary thing, now this is all born out of the press, okay? Just, the thing is that there's so many challenges within our profession in designing and problem solving. One mind isn't going to figure that out. You need to partner yourself with someone who doesn't think like you, though. And that was the key with myself, Chris, Greg, and Corey, was that we approach it so differently. And so finding others who have that drive and really want to solve those challenges, and yet also have like this aspiration in terms of design and material and architecture, but ultimately approach it differently, that's the key. That's the key of building, a potential a working environment for yourself that you can actually build upon. And so when you look at the office as shop, yeah, predominantly most people in a shop have architecture backgrounds, but we have people from construction, environmental science, physics, a lot of people programming, and it just gets you to look at projects and problems very differently. So I think, again, it's not a linear experience, and you need to collaborate with people who don't think like you.
I couldn't agree more. Some of our best projects are done in collaboration with actually other architectural practices. And certainly within the office, it's not just one person. And any project is a collaboration of a team of many different consultants. The personal journey is about just keeping yourself focused, but as Bill said, being part of a collaborative fabric. The projects today are so unbelievably complex. It would be impossible for you to think that you could just do it all yourself. And it also goes to your clients. The clients don't actually know finitely what they want. They know their objectives, but if you listen to them, if you put yourself in their shoes and listen, it actually, their words to you take you to another world as well. So you're always, it's not just the blank sheet of paper, there's the design. It really is an evolving process, and it's very complex. So again, it's not an easy magic wand answer.
Do we got any? There's a lady at the front here. Yeah, we go. Oh, we've got one here too. Yeah, we've got time for that. Two. That's it. Well then. No, I got you. Thank you, though. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Hi. I was wanting to hear a bit about the challenges and the tensions between producing great architecture and civic spaces, but also the commercial side of things and having to, deliver returns for developers. And also any, I think Shop in particular, you've had a development role in some of your projects, so just wanted to hear a bit about that.
Well, when I finished Columbia, when I graduated from Penn State, I had 12 job offers in construction and engineering. I graduated and I had no debt. I 5 years of architecture and engineering school, it was about $1,800 a semester. I graduated Columbia, no job prospect, huge amount of debt. And it's this whole thing about the avant-garde and starving artists. I remember Greg said, we're not starving. It's this whole thing about working with developers. It's like the dark side. We're talking about 1994. And this is again, coming back to your question. You know who you're working with. Greg had worked in investment. My partner Corey was in marketing, working with Oliver Carr, one of the major developers in DC. And we kind of like, okay, well, you know what? There's a lot of money to be made here, but we also want to stay true to our hearts and everything. And, understanding like how is the market, understanding the performa, understanding what your client's needs are. It's about, you becoming invested in their requirements and they as developers becoming invested in urban space and architecture and so forth. And I think that's where it comes down to, education. Not being pretentious, not assuming, not saying, hey, I've created this incredible vision and you've got to love it. Some architects have managed to do very well with that. And you always look at the kind of Frank Lloyd Wright model. But the point is, there are too many challenges. It's too complex. And you have to understand the performing. You have to understand the market. You have to understand the politics. You have to, and the challenge at the end of the day is transparency. And that, you have that challenge with construction, you have that challenge with your clients, but we always say, if you want Shop to do the best work, you gotta let us know everything. You gotta tell us, and we don't care if you change your mind, you throw every program at the book, but as long as we're all on the same page, we believe we will get to a resolution that will be a piece of architecture at the end of the day. So I think out of the gate, we said, look, we want to do great work, but we want to starve. And we have to understand like really what our clients are after and then also educate them in terms of what we can offer them. And so it's not about egos. The key is parking that at the door somehow. And again, inspiring and becoming vested, unified, becoming vested in an idea that will basically satisfies everyone's needs.
Did you want to chime in on that?
Yeah. When I first joined my partner, Katsalidis, we were very tiny and we couldn't wait around for a client. So Nanda, to his credit, was the developer behind the first building, Melbourne Terrace. And we're just architects, no money. He managed to find funders, good financial partners. And that gave us the opportunity to create a building that wasn't driven by anything other than us trying to do a new typology in the city. And that led on to Republic Tower, which was exactly the same. And Nanda was thinking of financing models to help people to come in and at discount prices, and ways of using their deposits by them becoming landowners, etc., to get this thing going. So it required a lot of innovative financing thinking, but it did enable us to do the buildings that we thought were right in that place. And because it was really at the start of that journey, I'm not sure how that would have gone if it was a developer coming to us in an untested market. He'd be, saying, you've got to do this in a certain way, and maybe that was right. But those two buildings particularly really started us in the search for a residential design typology that was meaningful both to the city and the occupants of the building, and to a form of housing that had to go forward.
So intertwined. We're going to take this last final question here. We find them afterwards at the bar, not at coffee. Please thank our guests, ladies and gentlemen, Bill and Karl. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks, Bill.